So, my mommy also wears a ring exactly like yours. A little black girl in a bright yellow dress shatters the silence of a tense boardroom. Her innocent words unravel a 7-year-old deadly corporate secret, forcing a ruthless CEO and a quiet data clerk hiding in the shadows to form an unlikely alliance to expose the truth. Where are you listening to this story from? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit subscribe for more thrilling tales. The Seattle sky was a bruised, unforgiving grey, weeping relentless sheets of rain that lashed violently against the floor-to-ceiling glass of Nexus Innovations. Below, the city was a miserable blur of red taillights and slick asphalt, drowning silently in the afternoon deluge. It was the kind of weather that made people want to disappear. In the boardroom on the 50th floor, disappearance was exactly what was being demanded. Julian Hayes sat perfectly still at the head of the long obsidian conference table. At 33, the CEO of Nexus was a study in absolute, chilling control. He had the kind of sharp, symmetrical features that looked carved from pale marble, and eyes the color of a frozen lake. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that felt less like clothing and more like armor. To the tech industry, Julian was a machine, a man who processed human emotion the way a computer processed faulty code by quarantining and deleting it. He had built towering walls around himself after taking over the company, maintaining no close friends, no public attachments, and an aura of icy distance that kept even his highest executives at bay. He was a man who did not bleed, or at least never allowed anyone to see the blood. Right now, he was watching a single, microscopic bubble detach from the bottom of his crystal water glass and float to the surface. It was the only thing moving in his vicinity. "The board is losing patience, Julian." A heavy voice cut through the hum of the air conditioning. Marcus Vance leaned forward, interlacing his thick fingers on the table. As the chairman of the board, Marcus possessed a suffocating kind of gravity. He was in his late 50s, a large, broad-shouldered man whose expensive, custom-made Italian suits barely contained his aggressive posture. His smile, which he deployed frequently, never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. Marcus was a corporate predator who had spent the last decade turning Nexus into his personal chessboard, and right now he was systematically maneuvering his own CEO into a corner. "This security flaw in the core system is catastrophic," Marcus continued, his tone dripping with a feigned paternal concern that made Julian's jaw tighten imperceptibly. "The press is starting to circle. If you cannot patch this breach by Friday, the board will have no choice but to ask for your resignation. We cannot let your failure sink the ship." Julian did not blink. He knew the flaw was a ghost, a deeply embedded error that no engineer could trace, almost as if it had been intentionally planted. He also suspected Marcus was the one holding the detonator. 30 floors below, in a stark, fluorescent-lit break room, Naomi Carter was trying very hard to hold her own life together. Naomi was a woman constructed of quiet, resilient dignity. A black woman in her late 20s, she possessed a striking, intelligent beauty that she actively tried to mute. Her posture was rigidly straight, a physical manifestation of a life built on extreme caution and hyper-vigilance. She was dressed in a pristine, stark white button-down shirt, starched to absolute unforgiving perfection, paired with sensible dark slacks. It was a uniform designed for invisibility, perfect for a low-level data entry clerk who needed to blend into the grey background of the corporate machine. Beneath her calm, guarded dark eyes lay the sharp, calculating mind of a brilliant software engineer, a past she had meticulously buried under mountains of mundane paperwork to protect herself and her child. She stood by the counter, waiting for the hot water dispenser to fill her paper cup with cheap tea. It was a Tuesday, but the Seattle School District had suddenly shut down due to a blown transformer in the heavy storm, leaving Naomi with no choice. She had been forced to bring her daughter to the end of her overtime shift. "Stay right at that table, baby," Naomi had instructed just minutes earlier. Chloe, however, was not one to stay put. 6 years old, Chloe was a vibrant burst of unfiltered sunshine, wrapped in a bright canary yellow dress that aggressively defied the Seattle gloom. She was fearless, endlessly curious, and possessed an old soul's observational gaze. Tucked firmly under her arm was Barnaby, a stuffed brown teddy bear. Barnaby was a veteran of many playground wars, most notably missing his left plastic eye, which had left behind a frayed cross of black thread. Chloe adamantly refused to let her mother sew a new one on, claiming Barnaby saw much better using his imagination. The water dispenser sputtered. A stray, dark drop of tea splashed violently against Naomi's immaculate white collar. Naomi sighed, closing her eyes for a brief second, a rare crack in her armored composure. She reached for a paper napkin, dabbing frantically at the stain. "Okay, Chloe, Mommy's almost done and then we can—" She turned around. The small circular table was empty. The bright yellow dress was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked through Naomi's chest. She dropped the paper cup. Back on the 50th floor, the boardroom was locked in a suffocating stalemate. Marcus was slowly pushing a printed document across the dark table, a preliminary resignation letter. The other board members, a collection of equally grey, silent suits, watched with bated breath. Julian looked down at his right hand, resting flat on the table. On his index finger sat a heavy titanium ring, its sleek surface etched with a continuous microscopic band of binary code. It was not a mere piece of jewelry, it was a relic. It was the only physical item left behind by the company's late founder. It was a unique, one-of-a-kind prototype. "Sign it, Julian," Marcus urged softly. Before Julian could reach for the pen, the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom clicked. The sound was so entirely out of place in the secure executive wing that all 12 heads snapped toward the entrance. The door pushed open, slowly at first, and then wider. Against the monochromatic backdrop of the corporate elite, she looked like a small, walking sun. Chloe stood in the doorway, her yellow dress swishing slightly around her knees, her one-eyed bear held casually by his fuzzy foot. She did not look intimidated by the cavernous room, the sweeping view of the violent storm outside, or the dozen powerful executives staring at her in absolute shock. She scanned the room with bright, inquisitive eyes until they landed on the man sitting at the head of the table. Julian Hayes felt a strange glitch in his usually flawless internal processing. He simply stared at the little girl making her way across the expensive charcoal carpet. The room was so silent that the soft squeak of her small sneakers echoed against the glass. She stopped right beside Julian's imposing chair. She tilted her head, analyzing him for a moment, and then her gaze dropped to his hand, resting near the resignation letter. Chloe pointed a small, confident finger at his right index finger. "Excuse me, mister," Chloe said, her voice a clear, ringing bell cutting through the suffocating tension of the room. "My mommy wears a ring exactly like yours, but she hides it on a necklace." No one breathed. The ambient hum of the building seemed to vanish entirely. Julian's heart hit his ribs like a hammer. His winter eyes locked onto the girl. "Exactly like yours. That was impossible." The ring was a singular creation. The other half of that binary sequence had burned to ash in a fire 7 years ago. Suddenly, the glass doors flew open violently. Naomi practically crashed into the room. Her chest was heaving, her perfectly parted hair slightly disheveled. The dark, coffee-colored stain on her crisp white collar stood out like a warning siren. The fierce, terrifying panic of a mother radiated from her, temporarily shattering her carefully constructed facade of invisibility.
"Chloe!" Naomi gasped. She lunged forward, grabbing the little girl's hand and pulling her securely against her side. Naomi didn't look at the board members. She didn't look at Marcus Vance. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, her voice trembling just enough to sound exactly like the terrified low-level employee she pretended to be. "I am so sorry," Naomi stammered rapidly, bowing her head in submission. "The school's closed early. She just wandered off while I was in the break room. It will never happen again. I apologize for the interruption. Please, excuse us." Without waiting for a single word of dismissal or reprimand, Naomi scooped Chloe up into her arms and fled the room.
The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, sealing the boardroom back in its grey, oppressive silence. Marcus cleared his throat, adjusting his tie, ready to resume his corporate execution. As I was saying, but Julian wasn't listening. He was staring at the empty space where the girl in the yellow dress had just stood. His cold, mechanical world had just been violently interrupted. The titanium ring on his finger suddenly felt burning hot against his skin. He looked at the closed door, the echo of the little girl's words playing on a relentless loop in his mind. A ghost had just walked into his boardroom, and she was wearing a white shirt with a stained collar. The Seattle storm had not broken by nightfall. It had merely settled into a steady, suffocating drizzle that slicked the city in a veneer of cold oil. High above the streets, Julian Hayes sat alone in his cavernous office, the only source of light coming from the 3 massive curved monitors illuminating his pale, statuesque face. The resignation letter Marcus Vance had pushed across the table hours ago remained unsigned, sitting near the edge of his mahogany desk like a dormant bomb. But Julian's mind was no longer entirely consumed by the catastrophic security flaw threatening his career. He was fixated on a ghost. Bypassing the standard human resources protocols, knowing that any official inquiry would instantly flag Marcus's surveillance systems, Julian utilized a backdoor entry into Nexus Innovations' deeply buried legacy servers. He typed the name Naomi Carter. The initial personnel file was deceptively thin, detailing a low-level data entry clerk who had been with the company for 5 years, possessing perfectly average performance reviews and 0 disciplinary actions. It was a digital mask, and Julian, a master of systems, knew how to peel it away. His fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, diving into the archived tax records and outdated payroll databases from nearly a decade ago. It took him 40 minutes to shatter the encryption on the restricted archives, but when the real file finally bloomed onto his screen, the breath hitched in his throat. Naomi Carter was not just a clerk. Her maiden name was Naomi Vance, though clearly no relation to Marcus. She was an MIT valedictorian, a former senior software architect, and the lead developer of the very core algorithm that Nexus was built upon. But it was the photograph attached to an old press release that made Julian's blood run cold. In the picture, a much younger Naomi was smiling radiantly, standing arm in arm with David Lin. David had been the brilliant, idealistic founder of Nexus Innovations, a man with famously unruly dark hair, a perpetually crooked smile, and a visionary mind that cared more about changing the world than monetizing it. He was also the man who had died horrifically in a laboratory fire 7 years ago, the tragedy that had allowed Marcus Vance to seize control of the company. A secondary document confirmed Julian's deepest suspicion. At the time of the fire, Naomi and David were engaged to be married. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening force. The ring on Chloe's necklace was David's ring. But why was a top-tier software engineer hiding in the basement of her dead fiancé's company, pretending to be a nobody? Before Julian could process the revelation, his central monitor flashed violently with a priority alert. A breaking news banner from a major financial network scrolled across the screen in glaring red letters. Information about Nexus's catastrophic core security flaw had just been leaked to the press. Julian watched in grim silence as the after-hours trading numbers began to freefall, the company's stock hemorrhaging value by the second. This was Marcus Vance's masterstroke. To execute the leak, Marcus had employed Elias Thorne, a notorious corporate PR fixer. Elias was a weaselly, nervous man in his late 40s, with thinning, grease-slicked hair and eyes that constantly darted around as if expecting an ambush. He traded in corporate espionage and ruined reputations, a bottom feeder who thrived on chaos. Through Elias, Marcus had ensured that the public panic would drive Nexus's valuation into the ground, perfectly paving the way for a sudden, suspiciously well-timed acquisition by a rival tech conglomerate, a conglomerate that Julian strongly suspected was a shadow corporation controlled by Marcus himself. The board would panic by morning, and Marcus would present the buyout as the only lifeboat left, effectively destroying Nexus and walking away with billions. Julian was running out of time, and the key to stopping Marcus was currently filing papers in the basement. Julian left his office, his tailored charcoal suit catching the dim emergency lights as he bypassed the executive elevators and took the service lift down into the bowels of the building. Sub-Level B was a depressing subterranean purgatory where the company's forgotten physical archives and data entry divisions were housed. As the elevator doors scraped open, Julian was immediately hit by the harsh, flickering glare of fluorescent tube lights and the overwhelming sterile stench of cheap industrial bleach. It was an environment designed to crush the human spirit, a stark contrast to the luxurious glass and mahogany of the 50th floor. He walked past rows of empty grey cubicles until he heard the rapid, rhythmic clatter of a keyboard in the far corner. Naomi Carter was sitting alone at a small, cramped desk piled high with dusty manila folders. Despite the late hour and the grimy surroundings, her appearance remained immaculate. The collar of her crisp white button-down shirt was heavily starched and ironed to an absolute, rigid perfection. It stood stiffly against her dark skin, a silent testament to her iron discipline, acting as a piece of psychological armor, protecting her from the despair of her surroundings. As Julian approached, the harsh smell of bleach momentarily receded, replaced by a very faint, soothing scent of lavender emanating from her desk, a tiny, secret rebellion against the sterile toxicity of the basement. Julian stopped a few feet away, his presence looming over her cubicle. Naomi's typing ceased abruptly. She did not jump or gasp, but her shoulders tightened, the starched white fabric of her shirt shifting slightly. "You're working very late for a data entry clerk," Julian said, his voice a low, cold baritone that echoed in the empty basement. Naomi slowly turned her chair to face him. Her expression was entirely blank, her eyes carefully guarded. "I have a quota to meet, Mr. Hayes. Is there something you need from the archives?" Julian stepped closer, his icy gaze piercing her carefully constructed facade. "I need to know why a senior architect with degrees from MIT is spending her nights inputting alphanumeric codes into a dead database.
I need to know why David Lynn's fiancée is hiding in my basement." The mention of David's name caused a microscopic fracture in Naomi's composure. Her jaw clenched tight, but she quickly smoothed her features, doubling down on her defense. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir. I think you have me confused with someone else."
"Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to finish this batch before my shift ends." "Your daughter recognized this," Julian pressed, holding up his right hand, the titanium ring catching the harsh fluorescent light. "There were only 2 ever forged. David had the other one. And 7 years ago, he died in a fire that I am beginning to suspect was not an accident at all." Naomi stood up sharply, her chair screeching against the linoleum floor. The fierce, protective instincts of a mother and the hardened resolve of a survivor flared dangerously in her dark eyes. The submissive clerk vanished, replaced by the brilliant, dangerous woman she truly was. "You need to leave my desk, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous glacial whisper that matched his own coldness. "You sit up there in your glass tower, thinking you understand how the world works because you read a few old files. You know nothing. You have no idea what you're dealing with or who is watching. Leave me alone and stay away from my daughter." The standoff between them was electric, a clash of 2 heavily armored individuals unwilling to yield an inch. Julian realized then that Naomi Carter was not a victim hiding in the dark. She was a predator lying in wait, and if he wanted her help to save Nexus, he was going to have to prove he wasn't just another one of Marcus Vance's pawns. Chapter 3. Jai Ma Ni Fan. It was 3 a.m. when Julian Hayes finally understood the terrifying depth of his own blindness. After his tense confrontation with Naomi in the basement, he had returned to his penthouse, a creeping paranoia taking root in his highly analytical mind. Naomi's fierce warning had triggered something. Julian was a man of systems, and he knew that systems only failed when they were manipulated from the inside. Bypassing his usual routine, he retrieved an old military-grade frequency scanner from a locked safe, a relic from his early days as a paranoid cybersecurity freelancer. He started with his encrypted corporate smartphone. The scanner immediately shrieked, detecting a microscopic, military-spec audio transmitter embedded directly into the phone's motherboard. A cold sweat broke out on Julian's neck. He drove back to Nexus Innovations under the cover of the relentless Seattle storm, slipping into his darkened 50th floor office. The scanner found 3 more bugs, one beneath the rim of his mahogany desk, one inside the binding of a decorative encyclopedia, and one wired into the smoke detector. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Marcus Vance had been listening to every conversation, every phone call, and every private muttered thought since the day Julian was appointed CEO. Julian wasn't a leader, he was a carefully selected puppet, a brilliant but isolated scapegoat installed to take the fall when Marcus eventually decided to sink the ship. The catastrophic security flaw wasn't an accident. Marcus had engineered it, using the surveillance to ensure Julian couldn't fix it in time. Quietly, without disabling the bugs and tipping off his enemy, Julian left the building. He purchased an untraceable burner phone from a 24-hour convenience store and sent a single, encrypted message to the emergency contact number listed in Naomi Carter's archived file. The message contained only a time, an address, and 2 words: David's ring. The next evening, the rain in Seattle was a fine, freezing mist that clung to the neon signs of the industrial district. Julian sat in the furthest corner booth of the Rusty Anchor, an old, dilapidated diner that smelled permanently of burnt coffee and frying oil. It was entirely off the corporate radar. Behind the counter stood Mildred, a weary waitress in her late 50s with deeply lined skin, a faded pink apron, and a raspy smoker's cough, who couldn't care less about the billionaire sitting in her booth. Julian wore a dark, inconspicuous trench coat over his vest. Before Naomi arrived, he consciously slid the titanium ring off his right index finger. The metal felt heavy, laden with lies he had unwittingly participated in. He slipped it quietly into the inner pocket of his suit vest, not wanting to trigger another defensive reaction from Naomi. A few minutes later, the diner bell chimed. Naomi walked in, shedding a damp raincoat to reveal her signature, sharply ironed white button-down shirt. She was not alone. Clinging to her hand was Chloe, the little girl radiating warmth in her bright yellow dress, holding her one-eyed stuffed bear, Barnaby. Naomi slid into the vinyl booth opposite Julian, her face a mask of weary suspicion, while Chloe scrambled onto the seat next to her mother. For a long moment, the booth was enveloped in a heavy, scrutinizing silence. Mildred dropped off 3 glasses of ice water and a small basket of complimentary crayons without a word. Chloe immediately grabbed a lemon-yellow crayon. She peeled back the paper wrapper with small, precise fingers and began to aggressively color a picture of a cartoon duck on the paper placemat. Every few seconds, however, Chloe would pause, lift her head, and stare directly at Julian with large, unblinking brown eyes. Julian, a man who regularly intimidated rooms full of ruthless Wall Street executives, found himself shifting uncomfortably under the gaze of a 6-year-old. He had 0 experience with children, and her innocent, penetrating stares made him feel entirely exposed. He cleared his throat, forcing his attention back to Naomi. "My office is wired," Julian said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the hum of the diner's ancient refrigerator. "My phone, my desk, everything. Marcus Vance has been listening to me for years. The security flaw destroying the company is his doing. He's setting me up to take the fall while he sells Nexus to a shell corporation." Naomi's dark eyes searched his face, looking for any trace of deception. The revelation that the IC CEO was actually a victim of the same puppeteer seemed to disarm a fraction of her defenses. She let out a slow, shaky breath, her shoulders dropping a millimeter. Reaching up to the collar of her stiff white shirt, she unfastened the top 2 buttons. From beneath the fabric, she pulled out a delicate, tarnished silver chain. Dangling from the center of it was the second titanium ring. It caught the flickering neon light, identical to the one Julian had hidden in his vest, its surface etched with the same cryptic binary code. "David didn't die in an accidental lab fire," Naomi whispered, the raw, unprocessed grief bleeding into her voice despite her best efforts to remain stoic. "He found out Marcus was embezzling company funds to build an illegal backdoor into the core algorithm, a backdoor he planned to sell to foreign data brokers." David was going to the authorities the next morning. Marcus made sure he never made it out of that building. Naomi clutched the ring on the necklace, her knuckles turning pale. "I knew if I spoke up, Marcus would kill me too, and I was pregnant with Chloe, so I disappeared into the basement. I let him think the brilliant Naomi Vance died of a broken heart, replaced by a drone doing data entry. For 5 years, I have been using the basement terminals to quietly dig through the legacy servers. David was paranoid at the end. He hid the original, untampered master source code somewhere in the mainframe, locked behind a cryptographic puzzle only I could solve. If I find it, it proves Marcus's backdoor exists, and it proves he murdered David for it." Julian stared at the woman across from him, awestruck by her sheer, terrifying resilience. The puzzle pieces had fully locked into place. He leaned forward, ignoring the awkwardness as Chloe handed him her lemon-yellow crayon.
"You have the knowledge to find the code," Julian said, his eyes locking onto Naomi's. "But you don't have the administrative access to bypass Marcus's new firewalls. I do. We have the same enemy, Naomi. I am done being a puppet." He placed the yellow crayon gently back on the table. "Let's tear his empire down."
The 50th floor executive suite, usually a sanctuary of icy corporate dominance, had been transformed into a clandestine command center. The storm outside had finally broken, leaving behind a thick, heavy Seattle fog that pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, isolating the office from the rest of the world. The room was dark, save for the intense bluish glow of Julian's massive curved monitors. Julian Hayes stood by the secure server terminal, bypassing his own biometric locks to generate a temporary, untraceable admin credential. He handed the tablet to Naomi. The moment her fingers touched the keyboard, the timid, hyper-cautious data entry clerk completely vanished. The transformation was profound and immediate. Naomi let out a long breath, unfastened the stiff cuffs of her pristine white button-down shirt, and meticulously rolled the sleeves up to her elbows. The physical act was like the shedding of a heavy armor she had been forced to wear for half a decade. Stripped of her disguise, the brilliant MIT architect emerged. Her dark eyes, usually cast downward in submission, were now fierce, sharp, and locked onto the cascading lines of code with a predatory focus. Julian leaned against the edge of the mahogany desk, silently observing her. For years, he had operated like a flawless, unfeeling machine, dismissing human connection as a vulnerability. But as he watched Naomi navigate the labyrinthine architecture of Nexus Innovations' legacy servers, he felt a strange magnetic pull. He was mesmerized by the sheer speed of her mind, the elegant, ruthless efficiency with which she bypassed archaic security protocols, and the steady, unwavering intensity of her gaze. There was no fear in her now, only the righteous, burning determination of a woman fighting for the ghost of the man she loved and the future of her daughter. Julian realized with a quiet sense of astonishment that he was deeply captivated by her. The icy fortress he had built around his own heart was beginning to thaw under the radiant heat of her intellect. Needing a moment to process the unfamiliar emotional shift, Julian stepped away from the desk and walked over to the executive kitchenette. For as long as he had been CEO, his late-night fuel consisted exclusively of bitter, pitch-black espresso, a drink that mirrored his austere lifestyle. But tonight, the thought of the bitter liquid felt wrong. He opened the private pantry, bypassing the imported coffee beans, and found a tin of artisanal cocoa powder he had received as a corporate gift and never opened. Moving with quiet precision, Julian personally heated the milk, whisking the rich chocolate until it was smooth and steaming. He walked back to the desk, carrying 2 ceramic mugs. He placed one gently beside Naomi's keyboard. The rich, sweet aroma of the hot chocolate wafted into the cold, sterile air of the office, mixing faintly with the lavender scent she always carried. Naomi paused her typing for a fraction of a second, her eyes darting from the steaming mug to Julian's face. She didn't say a word, but the corners of her mouth softened into a brief, genuine smile before she turned back to the screen. Julian took a sip from his own mug, the warmth spreading through his chest, anchoring him to this surreal, quiet moment of alliance. 10 miles away, in a windowless, subterranean server farm owned by one of Marcus Vance's shell corporations, a sudden alarm shattered the silence. Silas Kane jolted awake in his ergonomic chair. Silas was Marcus's lead Black Ops cybersecurity contractor, a lean, unnervingly pale man in his early 30s who lived on a diet of synthetic energy drinks and malicious code. He possessed a nervous, twitchy energy, his fingers constantly drumming against his thighs, but behind a computer screen, he was a ruthless digital mercenary. Silas stared at his monitors, his pale eyes narrowing. A high-level administrative ping had just bypassed the outer firewalls of the Nexus legacy servers. It was probing the exact quarantine sector where Marcus had buried the illegal backdoor algorithms. Silas grabbed his headset, his fingers flying across his mechanical keyboard. "We have a rat in the maze," Silas muttered to himself, initiating an aggressive countermeasure protocol. He launched a swarm of hunter-killer scripts designed to trace the IP, sever the connection, and permanently corrupt the terminal attempting the access. Back in the CEO's office, Naomi's screen flashed a violent, blinding crimson. A warning klaxon blared from the desktop speakers. "They found us," Naomi said, her voice tight but remarkably steady. "Marcus's hounds are in the system. They're deploying a localized EMP script to fry this terminal and lock down the mainframe." Julian immediately set his mug down and pulled up a secondary keyboard, linking his terminal to hers. "How much time do you need to extract David's cryptographic key?" 3 minutes. Naomi's fingers blurred across the keys, her rolled-up sleeves shifting with the rapid movement. "But they are flooding the routing nodes. I can't decrypt the puzzle and fight off a DDoS attack at the same time." "You don't have to," Julian commanded, his CEO persona returning, but this time fueled by purpose rather than cold ambition. "Focus on David's code. I'll hold them off." What followed was a brutal, invisible war waged in the silent space of the digital ether. Julian utilized his intimate knowledge of the company's current infrastructure to create phantom servers, bouncing Silas's malicious scripts into dead-end loops. It was a frantic game of cat and mouse. Every time Silas managed to break through a firewall, Julian slammed a new one down, sacrificing non-essential company servers to buy Naomi precious seconds. The temperature in the room seemed to spike. Julian's jaw was locked in intense concentration, his eyes tracking the invasive red lines of code, attempting to strangle their connection. "Julian, they're overriding the administrative privileges from an external route," Naomi warned, her eyes darting across the binary streams. "We have 60 seconds before we are permanently locked out." "I'm rerouting the power grid for the entire 49th floor to overload their inbound signal," Julian replied, his fingers striking the enter key with lethal force. "Do it now, Naomi." With 10 seconds left, Naomi encountered the final cryptographic lock, a sequence based on a localized fractal equation David had designed. She closed her eyes for a millisecond, trusting her memory, and typed the final string of characters. The red warning screens instantly vanished, replaced by a serene, glowing green window. The master source code, complete with David Lynn's original digital signature, began downloading into their encrypted, isolated hard drive. Just as the progress bar hit 100%, Julian manually severed the physical hardline connection to the terminal. The screens went entirely black. They sat in the sudden, suffocating darkness of the office, the only sound being the heavy, synchronized rhythm of their breathing. Naomi slumped back in the leather chair, letting out a trembling sigh of relief. Julian looked at her in the dim light filtering through the fog outside. They had won the battle. They possessed the weapon to destroy Marcus Vance. And in the quiet aftermath of the digital storm, as Julian handed her the mug of hot chocolate that was still warm, they both knew that the grey, isolated worlds they had lived in were gone forever. The atmosphere inside the 50th floor boardroom of Nexus Innovations was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and impending corporate slaughter. The morning Seattle light struggled to penetrate the heavy storm clouds outside, casting a pallid, grey wash over the 12 executives seated around the obsidian table. At the head of the room, Marcus Vance stood, radiating the smug, untouchable confidence of a man who had successfully rigged the game. To his immediate right sat a new face, Victor Sterling. Victor was the proxy representative for the shadow conglomerate poised to buy Nexus for pennies on the dollar. He was a slick, overly tanned corporate vulture in his late 40s, wearing a sharply tailored pinstripe suit that screamed Wall Street excess. Victor possessed the restless, predatory energy of a shark, constantly checking a heavy gold Rolex on his wrist, eager to sign the papers and finalize the slaughter. Marcus cleared his throat, commanding the room's attention to initiate the final phase of his master plan. He delivered a gravely rehearsed speech about the tragic, insurmountable security flaws that had brought Nexus to its knees under Julian Hayes' leadership, officially calling for an emergency vote to oust the CEO and approve Victor Sterling's immediate buyout. Just as Marcus raised his hand to cast the first vote, the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open with a resounding crack that echoed like a gunshot. The room froze. Julian Hayes walked in, but he did not carry the defeated posture of a man about to be publicly executed. He exuded an aura of absolute glacial authority, his winter eyes locked onto Marcus with lethal intent. But it was the person walking beside him that caused the collective breath of the board members to hitch. Naomi Carter had entirely shed the invisible armor of the timid basement clerk. She was dressed in a striking, impeccably tailored, pristine white power suit that contrasted sharply with her dark, flawless skin. The crisp lines of the suit radiated an unyielding, formidable strength, making her look less like an employee and more like an avenging angel descending upon the boardroom. She walked with a measured, predatory grace, holding a heavily encrypted titanium drive in her right hand. Marcus's smug smile faltered, his thick fingers twitching against the mahogany table as he failed to recognize the low-level data entry clerk who had suddenly transformed into a titan. "This meeting is not adjourned, and my position is not vacant," Julian announced, his voice a low, commanding baritone that left no room for argument. He stepped aside, allowing Naomi to approach the master presentation console. Without asking for permission, she plugged the titanium drive into the terminal and bypassed the boardroom security protocols in 3 rapid keystrokes. The massive LED screens behind Marcus violently flickered, instantly replacing his fabricated financial projections with cascading walls of brilliant green binary code. "My name is Naomi Vance," she declared, her voice ringing clear and steady, echoing with the weight of a 7-year silence. Former senior software architect of Nexus Innovations and the legal beneficiary of David Lynn's estate. And what you are looking at is the original, untampered master source code of this company. Naomi hit the enter key. The code separated, revealing a hidden digital watermark, David Lynn's personal cryptographic signature. David did not die in a tragic accident, Naomi continued, her dark eyes pinning Marcus to his chair. He was murdered because he discovered a fatal, illegal backdoor engineered into our core servers, a backdoor designed to siphon restricted user data to offshore data brokers. Before Marcus could scream an objection, Naomi brought up the secondary files she and Julian had excavated during their night in the digital trenches. The screens shifted to display a complex web of encrypted financial ledgers. Red lines connected Marcus Vance's private offshore shell accounts directly to a string of illicit payments made to a known arson syndicate exactly 1 week before the laboratory fire that killed David. The paper trail was absolute, flawless, and irrefutable. Chaos erupted around the obsidian table. The board members, realizing they were accessories to a massive federal crime, began shouting over one another. Victor Sterling, the slick proxy buyer, went pale beneath his artificial tan. Recognizing a sinking ship, Victor didn't say a single word. He simply snapped his Italian leather briefcase shut, stood up, and practically sprinted out of the boardroom, instantly collapsing the multi-billion-dollar acquisition. The shadow deal was dead. Marcus Vance's face contorted into a mask of pure, trapped terror. He tried to stand, opening his mouth to deny the accusations, but his legendary composure shattered completely. His hands shook violently. As he reached for the edge of the table to steady himself, his heavy, gold-rimmed reading glasses slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the plush carpet with a muffled, pathetic thud. He was completely abandoned, his empire of lies evaporating in the span of 3 minutes. The final nail in the coffin arrived perfectly on cue. The boardroom doors opened once more, and Detective Sarah Reyes walked in, flanked by 3 uniformed Seattle police officers. Detective Reyes was a no-nonsense woman in her mid-40s, with tired but razor-sharp eyes, wearing a standard-issue trench coat over her badge. She stepped over Marcus's fallen glasses without looking down. "Marcus Vance," Detective Reyes said, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from her belt, her voice cutting through the remaining boardroom chatter. "You are under arrest for corporate espionage, grand wire fraud, and the first-degree murder of David Lynn. You have the right to remain silent." While the boardroom descended into unprecedented historical chaos, a profound and beautiful serenity existed just 1 wall away. Safely tucked inside Julian's expansive, soundproof CEO office, little Chloe was sitting cross-legged on the plush rug. Her bright yellow dress formed a cheerful puddle of color on the dark floor. She was entirely oblivious to the corporate bloodbath and the police presence next door. Instead, her brow was furrowed in adorable concentration as she happily played with Julian's most prized desk ornament, a wildly expensive, mathematically complex bespoke wooden puzzle sphere. She hummed a quiet, happy tune to her one-eyed bear, Barnaby, who was propped up against a desk leg to watch. With a triumphant little smile, Chloe slotted the final wooden piece into place, perfectly solving the puzzle just as the heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around Marcus Vance's wrists in the room next door. The relentless Seattle storm that had battered the city for a week finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a crisp, cleansed atmosphere that mirrored the monumental shift inside Nexus Innovations. Across the city, television screens and financial monitors were dominated by the breaking news. Elena Rostova, a prominent financial journalist known for her razor-sharp platinum bob and aggressive, rapid-fire delivery, reported live from outside the Nexus headquarters. Elena was a woman in her late 30s who usually covered corporate disasters with a cynical smirk, but today her tone was genuinely electrified. "The Great Purge at Nexus Innovations has sent shockwaves through the tech sector," she announced to millions of viewers. Following the dramatic arrest of former chairman Marcus Vance, the company has undergone a massive, unprecedented restructuring. The market has responded with overwhelming enthusiasm to this newfound transparency, sending Nexus stock soaring by 40% in a single trading session. The shadow that had loomed over the company was officially dead, replaced by the brilliant, undeniable light of truth. Inside the executive wing on the 50th floor, the suffocating grayness was gone. Naomi Carter stood in the center of the Chief Technology Officer's suite, a space that was entirely hers. She had been fully restored to her rightful honor, inheriting David Lynn's massive block of shares and taking her place as the company's leading visionary. She no longer wore the rigid, starched white shirts of a terrified data clerk. Today, she wore a soft, elegant cream blouse, her posture relaxed and commanding. Beside her stood Julian Hayes, but he was no longer the icy, untouchable CEO. In a move that had stunned Wall Street but made perfect sense to him, Julian had voluntarily resigned from the highest seat of power. He realized that the CEO title was an armor he no longer needed. Instead, he chose to step back, taking a seat on the advisory board to act as a protective shield for Naomi while she focused on the technology. Together, they were tearing down the invasive data mining infrastructure Marcus had built and reconstructing Nexus according to David's original humanitarian vision. Julian looked at Naomi as she confidently directed a team of engineers, and for the first time in his adult life, the deep permafrost of his heart completely melted. He wasn't a machine anymore. He was a man who had finally found a purpose worth fighting for, and a woman who had taught him how to feel. Later that same afternoon, as the workday wound down, Julian drove his car through the quiet, leafy streets of Naomi's neighborhood. The man behind the steering wheel bore little resemblance to the mechanical corporate titan of the past. He had traded his imposing, tailored charcoal suits for a simple, incredibly soft, navy blue cashmere sweater and dark jeans. He looked younger, lighter, and surprisingly human. Resting on the passenger seat of his car were two items he had spent an embarrassing amount of time selecting: a rectangular pink box of artisanal donuts from a famous local bakery, and a tiny, bright yellow umbrella. He had seen the umbrella in a shop window and immediately thought of a fearless little girl who defied the Seattle gloom. Julian parked his car, gathered the items, and walked up the steps to Naomi's apartment building. His heart, which had remained perfectly steady during hostile billion-dollar takeovers, now beat with a strange, nervous rhythm. He knocked on the wooden door. A moment later, the door swung open. Naomi stood in the entryway, dressed comfortably in soft grey sweatpants and a loose knitted top. The heavy, guarded look that had defined her existence for 7 years was entirely gone, replaced by a radiant, breathtaking expression of profound relief. When she saw Julian standing there in his casual clothes, a warm, genuine smile spread across her face. Before either of them could speak, a blur of yellow darted past Naomi's legs. Chloe, wearing her favorite bright dress and clutching the one-eyed Barnaby, squealed with absolute delight. She didn't hesitate for a second, launching herself forward and wrapping her small arms tightly around Julian's leg in a fierce, affectionate hug. Julian froze for a fraction of a second, still unaccustomed to such pure, unfiltered affection. But then he smiled, a real, reaching-the-eyes smile, and gently patted the little girl's head, presenting the pink box of donuts and the bright yellow umbrella. Chloe gasped in awe, immediately grabbing the tiny umbrella and declaring it the best thing she had ever seen. Above Chloe's head, Julian and Naomi locked eyes. There were no dramatic declarations of love, no cheesy, sweeping cinematic confessions. They were two survivors who had walked through the fire together, and what they shared in that quiet hallway was much deeper than mere romance. It was a profound, unshakable peace and a silent, mutual understanding that they no longer had to fight their battles alone. As they stood there in the doorway, the notoriously stubborn Seattle clouds outside finally parted. A brilliant, golden beam of late afternoon sunlight pierced through the grey, washing over the wet pavement and bathing the apartment in a warm, honeyed glow. It was the end of a long, terrifying storm and the gentle, radiant beginning of a beautiful new life for all three of them. The beautiful lesson from this story is that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way to the light. In our daily lives, we often build heavy walls around our hearts to protect ourselves from pain, just like Julian and Naomi did. We wear invisible masks to survive our daily struggles. But sometimes all it takes is a small spark of innocence and a leap of faith to melt the ice and bring warmth back into our world. When we choose to trust each other and stand together for what is right, we can clear the darkest storms. If you found comfort in this story, please share it with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more meaningful tales. May God bless you and your family with peace and strength. If you believe that light will always overcome the darkness and that truth will heal the deepest wounds, Please comment Amen below to share this beautiful blessing with everyone.